Welcome back to a year of Final Fantasy, and we are still in the month of Ifrit. We're about to wrap it up, but today I want to get to the rest of the Final Fantasy VII Compilation odds and ends that I wanted to tie up, and I also want to just give a brief overview of it, where it came from, why it came from the places that it did, and what's going to happen going forward with the Final Fantasy VII franchise. I'm sure most of you know, but we'll talk about it just a very little bit. Anyway, let's start off with the renaissance of Final Fantasy VII. So Final Fantasy VII was a smash hit in the industry and a huge milestone for the video game medium altogether. And we'll get into all that next time whenever we do talk about Final Fantasy VII properly. So for those that don't know though, this Final Fantasy VII compilation was more of a cinematic universe that we see that's all the rage now in the movie industry. All in all, there were 4 major games in this compilation series, none of them being what most people would call true sequels or prequels to the games, as they don't really use any of the systems that were established in the RPG of Final Fantasy VII proper, and I'm really specifically talking about the battle systems. They are also other stories that are taking place within this universe that's been created. The most prequel-ish, I guess, would be Final Fantasy Crisis Core on the PSP that we talked about, and really a proper sequel would be the movie Final Fantasy VII Advent Children, and these two span across PlayStation and movie medium, so it doesn't really hold in that conventional prequel-sequel sense that we would think of whenever we say a sequel to Final Fantasy VII. Anyway, we've talked about all that stuff before. Let's get into the actual genesis, no pun intended, of this project. Yoshinori Kitase, one of the original directors for Final Fantasy VII, along with the strong uprising of Tetsuya Nomura, headed up this project. Now, Square wanted to diversify their media from a marketing standpoint, expanding into different genres and platforms and media such as movies. Well, actually, they wanted to do it right this time, considering that failure that was Final Fantasy Spirits Within. This, as I said before, was something much more ambitious than just a prequel or a sequel to the game, but a creation of a broader universe, and this was driven by a couple of factors. One, we had a big shift in gaming to mobile and portable platforms, and the rampant fans were also begging for more Final Fantasy VII. And lastly, strangely enough, the surprising lucrative outing of Final Fantasy X-2. Now, Final Fantasy X-2 is generally despised by a lot of fans. I personally enjoy it, we'll talk about that later. But it did so well, it let the producers know that having expansions to upcoming major franchise games could be very lucrative, and as before, there really hadn't been a true sequel to a proper Final Fantasy game, save for that Final Fantasy V anime that we talked about a few months ago, but that was hardly popular and was pretty much immediately forgotten. Final Fantasy X-2 paved the way for this big compilation project, but there was one big difference here, the fact that that game was actually a direct sequel to 10, while this was just something completely different and really altogether unheard of. Each entry into this Final Fantasy VII compilation would be radically different from each of the other entries in the way of the games and how they functioned just in general. Before Crisis was a mobile game about the Turks, Crisis Core was a semi-ish real-time action game, Dirge of Cerberus was a full action game that was third-person shooter, and Advent Children was simply a full-blown movie. So because of this, while the reception was mind-blowing to the original Final Fantasy VII game that came out on PlayStation, it set up standards for this universe of games that were amazingly high. And overall, this compilation was basically mixed. I mean, there were some standouts, Crisis Core was good, but just if you take them all together, all of these different projects, it just really didn't strike a chord with the fans that loved Final Fantasy VII for what it was. Now, there are several different factors that went into that reception. Like I said, none of these really felt like Final Fantasy VII. You know, people wanted another turn-based RPG, and they just really didn't get that. Not any of them were, really unspeakably awful. It's just the people that wanted Final Fantasy VII, they were not given anything that rekindled that love for that gameplay, that style of game. So this compilation, it has some hits and snags there, but as we'll see moving forward, it does actually pave the ground for some other similar compilations that we'll get into a little bit later. But there were some games and things like that that I did not go over in this past month, and I want to talk about them here. Now, I didn't go over them because they're honestly not that big of a deal. So first off, let's talk about The Last Order. I had briefly mentioned The Last Order, I believe at the end of the Final Fantasy Advent Children episode, and what The Last Order is it's an anime, it's an OVA that wasn't really officially released here in the West with standard dubs, but there are subbed versions out there floating around the internet. It's well drawn, but essentially doesn't really add much to the overall story story. It talks about Zack and Cloud's story before the original game, which we pretty much already know from Crisis Core and the flashback scenes from Final Fantasy VII. It's still really interesting to look at to see what an anime about Final Fantasy VII could have looked like, but really, there's nothing of substance here that you can't get elsewhere. The other few things in this compilation were the novellas that were released, which I had actually talked about in episode 15, which were the novelizations. And the major ones of these novellas were known as On the Way to a Smile, and it featured several various stories about characters right after the proper game leading up to Advent Children, as well as one about one of the main characters in Advent Children, Denzel. There actually also exists another novella known as, let me get this right, Hoshi wo Meguro Otome. Sorry if I completely butchered that, but that details Eris's journey through the live stream during the later parts of Final Fantasy VII. And even furthermore, I didn't really mention this in the novel series, and I probably should have, but there's a novel known as Final Fantasy VII Lateral Biography Turks, The Kids Are All Right, which is in the same vein as On the Way to a Smile, except this novel, it's a little bit longer than the novellas, is actually a full novel focusing in on the Turks right after the first game. And finally, there were just a few mobile games. I don't even know if these are really part of the compilation, but I'll go ahead and assume that they are. And these were the first of which being Final Fantasy VII Snowboarding, which is a standalone minigame that you can play in the Golden Saucer in the original game, and they ported this to mobile phones. And personally, I love this mini snowboarding game. I played it all the time in the original game, but it's nice to have it come out over here. And the second one was finally called G-Bike, which is similar in the fact that it's the biking minigame from Final Fantasy VII. But sadly, even though these were decent ports, there weren't anything, mind-blowing. They were actually defunct as of this recording, which is on July 24th, 2017. Now, you may be able to emulate them or something. I haven't checked into that, but you can't really get them properly on mobile devices anymore. So this experiment wasn't really the biggest hit in terms of success garnered, especially compared to the original game, though, as I mentioned briefly before, it did pave the way for some similar projects from Square in the future. Things like the Ivalice Alliance, which is a similar project revolving around the Ivalice game world, which we're going to talk about whenever we get to the Final Fantasy XII month. And then we also have Fabula Nova Crystallis, which we've just come out on the tail end of, and that encompassed a lot of different games like Final Fantasy XIII Trilogy, Type 0, and debatably Final Fantasy 15. It kind of shook off that name whenever it transitioned from the Versus 13 to a proper Final Fantasy 15 that we know today, though it still does share a lot of similarities with how the Crystal mythology plays into that group of games. Of course, it didn't really only pave the way for those projects, but for another one as well. Probably the most mind-blowing announcement in the past few years in the video game industry was the fact that this compilation showed that there were still hordes and hordes of fans clamoring for that often rumored but never really spoken out loud Final Fantasy VII Remake. And I'm sorry, but I'm gonna have to leave that right there. We'll talk about the future of Final Fantasy later on down the road. As of this point, as of this recording, we don't really know a ton about the remake, so I don't want to have any speculation that will show its date later on. So that is in the future of Final Fantasy, and just look forward to that probably near March of next year. All that being said, this compilation project would not exist if it were not for the proper game known as Final Fantasy VII, one of the biggest hits in the video game industry ever, which we're going to get into next time as we round out this month of Ifrit. Thank you all so much for watching. Please share, like, comment, subscribe, do all of that cool stuff, help us out. And with that being said, until next time, Crystal Warriors, keep on gaming.